I choose the court. The words came quietly from Manuel Ramirez as he stood at the defendant's table, hands folded neatly in front of him. It wasn't a performance, just a calm, assured decision. The moment the courtroom learned he had waived his right to a jury, a hush fell. Even the reporters, who had been whispering and adjusting their equipment, stopped. Just a simple act that carried more weight than most could see. Whether it was trust or resignation, Judge Caprio couldn't yet tell. The clock on the wall ticked slowly, each second carving through the thick summer air like a quiet blade. Frank Caprio didn't move. His eyes remained on the young man standing before him. In all his years on the bench, there had been rare moments when instinct said more than the law could. And this was one of them. He adjusted his glasses, scanning the notes he had made during the prosecution's opening statements. The evidence on paper was tidy, neat, predictable. A stolen car, a pursuit, fingerprints, testimony from an officer. All of it wrapped in legal precision like a sealed envelope. But something about the way Manuel held himself, calm, unreadable, suggested the contents of that envelope might not be what they seemed. "Mr. Ramirez," Caprio said gently, his voice measured. "Do you understand the implications of waiving your right to a jury?" "Yes, Your Honor," Manuel replied, looking up for the first time. His voice was quiet but unwavering. "I understand. I trust you." A strange stillness fell over the room, the kind that follows a sentence no one quite knows how to answer. Frank nodded slowly, his heart registering what his face did not reveal. It had been a long time since someone had looked at him that way, not with fear or calculation or even hope, but with something deeper. Like Manuel wasn't asking for mercy. He was asking for fairness. The prosecution resumed, calling Officer Langley to the stand. The man's badge glinted under the courtroom lights as he recounted the night he'd spotted the Audi. "We received a report of a stolen vehicle around 8:45 p.m. I identified a car matching the description parked outside a closed gas station. The suspect was inside. As I approached, he fled." "And you're certain the defendant was the one behind the wheel?" the prosecutor asked. Langley hesitated for the briefest of moments. "Yes, he matched the description. Latino male, gray hoodie, slim build. He ran toward the East Avenue overpass." Frank looked over at Manuel, who stared ahead, expressionless. Not nervous, not smug, just steady. It was the kind of steadiness that comes from someone who's been preparing for something for a very long time. "Any dashcam footage?" Caprio inquired. The prosecutor shook his head. "No, Your Honor. The officer's vehicle was not equipped with a camera at the time." A small detail, perhaps, but it landed heavily in Frank's mind. No visual confirmation, just a description, a memory. He turned back to Manuel. "Do you have any response, Mr. Ramirez?" Manuel stepped forward. "I was there, sir, near the gas station. I was walking home from a friend's place, but I wasn't in that car. I wasn't running from anyone. I was walking." "Do you have someone who can confirm your location?" Manuel nodded. "Yes, but I want to speak first, if that's all right." Frank gestured for him to continue. "There's something about the way things work, Your Honor," Manuel said slowly, eyes flickering toward the ceiling as if searching for the words he'd practiced 1,000 times in silence. "People see someone who looks like me, and they stop seeing anything else. That's not new, but this time it matters, because the man Officer Langley saw, maybe he did have a gray hoodie. Maybe he was running. But that's not all it takes to know someone. I didn't run. I didn't hide. I went home and went to bed. I found out the next morning that a car had been stolen down the street." Frank felt the words settle in the room like dust in sunlight. He watched the prosecutor shift in her seat, flipping through papers that no longer seemed to carry as much weight. A few members of the press scribbled down quotes. The law didn't deal in gut feelings, but sometimes experience whispered louder than protocol. The courtroom had never been so still. Even the air seemed to pause, as if holding its breath with the rest of the gallery. Manuel Ramirez had just stood up, quietly told his court-appointed attorney to step aside, and announced, "I will represent myself, Your Honor." Judge Caprio adjusted his glasses, his tone calm but firm. "Mr. Ramirez, you're entitled to a public defender at no cost. You don't have to do this alone." Manuel looked up, his voice steady. "I understand, Your Honor, but I've prepared for this. I'd like to speak for myself." No dramatics, no hesitation, just a quiet certainty that cut through the murmur of disbelief that followed. Frank Caprio didn't speak right away. His gavel remained untouched, fingertips folded lightly beneath his chin. His eyes, however, never left the boy. 18, at most. Slim, modestly dressed, hands still in the pockets of a gray hoodie. And yet here he was, standing alone before a system that rarely listened to kids like him. Frank had heard hundreds of defendants claim innocence. He had watched smooth-talking lawyers twist facts into fiction. But this wasn't that. This was something else. Across the aisle, the prosecutor, Eleanor Monroe, let out a faint, ironic chuckle. "Well, this should be interesting," she muttered, loud enough for the clerk beside her to hear. A few in the audience chuckled along, though the sound died quickly. Frank wasn't laughing. "Proceed, Mr. Ramirez," the judge said, voice even but low. Manuel stepped forward, drawing a quiet creak from the wooden floor beneath him. He asked the court to revisit Officer Langley's testimony, not the tone, the details. He spoke without notes, yet his memory was sharp. "Your Honor," he began, "the officer claimed he saw me flee from the driver's seat, but according to the dispatch log, the report of the stolen vehicle came in at 8:45. Officer Langley's own shift log shows he didn't clock in until 9:10. Frank blinked once. That detail hadn't made it into the prosecution's summary, not even into the defense file. Manuel continued, "I respectfully request the officer's GPS records from that evening. If his claim is accurate, they'll show he was at the scene before I was detained. If not," he let the sentence trail off, letting the silence speak for him. Frank leaned back, pensively adjusting his robe. Then came the fingerprints. "My prints were on the car," Manuel said, "but not because I stole it. The car was parked outside a 7-Eleven for hours. I leaned against it, opened the unlocked door. Didn't take a thing. Just being a curious idiot, maybe, but touching something isn't the same as stealing it." The room shifted again. A few jurors looked at each other. Monroe was already flipping through her folders with a furrowed brow. Frank watched Manuel intently, the boy's voice as steady as his posture. He didn't look like someone trying to escape punishment. He looked like someone asking, pleading even, to be understood. And then, without warning, something inside Frank stirred. A memory. Chicago. A winter court session nearly 3 decades ago. Frank had been a newly elected city councilman, invited to sit in on a juvenile sentencing hearing as part of a community outreach initiative. The defendant had been a 17-year-old black boy, charged with armed robbery based on circumstantial evidence, poor security footage, a partial ID, and a weapon found blocks away. The public defender barely spoke. The judge sentenced him to 10 years. Frank remembered the boy's face, calm, accepting, and he remembered doing nothing. 3 years later, that same boy hanged himself in prison. A re-examination of the case, too late, too quiet, revealed he hadn't even been in the city the night of the crime. Frank had read the report alone in his office, closed the file, never spoke of it again. Until now. Because as he watched Manuel move with deliberate calm, layer by layer unraveling the state's narrative, that old ache returned, not as guilt, as reckoning. The boy was smart. But this wasn't about cleverness. This was about voice, and how, once again, the system had tried to decide whose voice mattered. Frank felt the tightness in his chest again, that quiet, creeping fear, not of scandal, not of headlines. No, this was different. This was the fear of being wrong again, and knowing what that meant, not for his legacy, for someone else's life. Manuel was still speaking. "Your Honor, I'm not asking you to believe me. I'm asking you to look again, to look closer. And Frank did. He looked, not just at the facts, but at the boy, and at what it meant that Manuel had chosen him, not a jury of strangers, not a chance at sympathy, but him, Frank Caprio, the man who once stayed silent when he shouldn't have. A soft knock on the courtroom door signaled the return of the officer with the requested dispatch logs. Frank didn't move to take them just yet. His eyes were still on Manuel, and for the first time in years, he whispered inwardly, "God, don't let me fail this one." The gavel remained still. The room waited. And Frank, in the quiet of that moment, understood that the verdict in his own heart had already been reached. Frank leaned forward slightly. "We'll hear from your witness after the recess. In the meantime, I want a copy of the police dispatch logs from that night. If there's any delay or inconsistency, I want to see it." He banged his gavel softly. "Court is in recess." The conference room was windowless and cold, not by temperature, but by atmosphere. The kind of cold that came from too many years of polished procedure and not enough heart. Judge Frank Caprio sat near the end of a long oak table, flanked by colleagues in robes, attorneys from the district's legal board, and a senior court liaison who wore his smile like armor. They weren't here to talk. Not really. The tone was set the moment the liaison cleared his throat and tapped the folder in front of him. "This Ramirez case," he began, without looking up. "It's getting attention." Frank remained still. He knew what that meant. "There's chatter online, editorials, tweets, kids calling him the new face of resistance. The court can't afford to become the stage for a political performance." A few judges murmured agreement. One tapped a pen against the table like a metronome for their shared discomfort. "We're not here to rewrite narratives," the liaison continued. "We're here to keep order. That boy is clever, no doubt, but someone's coaching him, maybe even grooming him, and we're not going to give him a platform for that." Frank inhaled slowly, letting the air settle in his lungs before speaking. "He hasn't asked for a platform," he said quietly. "He asked for a fair hearing." The liaison offered a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Come on, Frank, we both know optics matter. He waived a jury trial, chose you. That's not a legal strategy, it's a media move. He's playing the system like a piano. You don't want to be part of that performance." Caprio's gaze dropped to the wood grain of the table. He traced it with his eyes, remembering how many hours he'd spent as a young man reading about justice, never realizing how often justice came dressed in a suit, speaking softly, asking you to look the other way. "We just need this closed," the liaison added. "Quickly, cleanly, don't let it linger. The press loves a drawn-out story, especially one that smells like rebellion." Frank didn't argue. He just nodded slightly and stood when the meeting ended, the pressure gathering in his chest like a storm that had no outlet. That evening, he sat alone in his study with a copy of the Los Angeles Chronicle folded across his lap. The headline stared back at him in thick, bold letters. "Boy faces the system and doesn't blink." The photo beneath it caught him off guard. It was Manuel, standing just outside the courthouse steps. But it was the eyes that held him, the same steady, clear gaze that had followed him in the courtroom. Not angry, not defiant, just present. As if the boy had already accepted the weight of what might come and stood anyway. Frank ran a hand over his face, feeling older than usual. He thought of another boy, one from nearly 20 years ago. 17. Black. Arrested on circumstantial evidence and sentenced to 9 years. The case had followed procedure to the letter, but Frank had never forgotten the look in that mother's eyes when the verdict was read. It hadn't felt like justice, it felt like surrender. And now here he was again. He closed the newspaper and leaned back in his chair, the springs groaning softly beneath him. Somewhere in the other room, the TV murmured, ignored. He stared at the ceiling, hearing again the words from that morning. "This is work, Frank, not a philosophy class." But what was justice without a conscience? He stood up and walked to the bookshelf, his fingers brushing over worn spines, titles he hadn't touched in years. He wasn't looking for anything in particular, maybe just grounding, maybe a sign that he hadn't imagined the weight of what he carried. If he ruled wrongly, Manuel would be the next casualty. Another name in a system that moved too quickly to notice it had veered off course. Another boy lost, not to crime, but to a kind of silence that made it easier for people to sleep at night. He turned off the light in the study, but the thought followed him down the hallway. This wasn't just a case anymore, it hadn't been for a while. And as Frank lay in bed that night, eyes open in the dark, he knew one thing for certain. Tomorrow, he would return to the courtroom not just as a judge, but as a man willing to remember that some truths don't come printed in files. Some truths come in the form of a quiet boy who refuses to flinch. That afternoon, with no witnesses present, the prosecutor asked for a delay in proceedings, and Frank had no choice but to grant it. The next morning, Judge Frank Caprio sat quietly in his office. Outside, the city moved with its usual morning rhythm. Cars passed with a tired hum. Distant voices rose and fell like the notes of a fading song. But inside, Frank was adrift in the layered weight of his thoughts. Frank rested his rating glasses on the file before him. Manuel Ramirez, 18, no prior convictions, no gang ties, no school suspensions. And there, tucked among the scanned pages of arrest reports and procedural notes, a detail that had slipped past him earlier, his mother's occupation. Rosa Ramirez, legal assistant, 23 years of service. Frank blinked slowly. Something about that line clung to him. He closed the file gently and leaned back, his eyes drifting to the framed photograph on the corner of his desk. His father, arms crossed, sleeves rolled, standing proudly outside the shoe repair shop where Frank had worked as a boy. That shop had been their everything, and Frank, barely taller than the counter, had spent his afternoons shining shoes in front of the courthouse, watching men in suits pass by like shadows, unreachable, untouchable. He remembered the weight of the brush in his hand, the rhythm of the polish, the way his fingertips smelled faintly of leather and sweat even after washing. He remembered saving every nickel to buy a second-hand dictionary and reading it under the glow of a flickering bulb while his mother folded laundry in silence. He had forgotten somehow how close to the ground he once lived. His fingers tapped absently on the edge of Manuel's file. A little boy, slim, quiet, smart in a way that didn't come from classrooms. Caprio could see him now, standing still as the courtroom buzzed around him, eyes steady, not flinching when spoken to, not flaring up when accused. For the first time in years, Frank felt something inside shift. It wasn't pity, it wasn't guilt, it was recognition. Manuel reminded him of a boy he once was, a boy who used to wash dishes in a hotel basement for 25 cents an hour, just so his mother didn't have to skip dinner again. A boy who heard the word lawyer and didn't think of power, but of dignity, of finally being allowed to speak and be heard. He opened the file again and looked not at the charges, but at the person. Manuel Ramirez had lived in the same two-bedroom apartment for 17 years. His grades were modest but consistent. His mother's signature appeared on every parent-teacher conference form. No red flags, no complaints, just survival. Caprio ran a hand through his thinning hair, let out a long, tired breath. The chair creaked beneath him. He wasn't supposed to feel this way. Judges weren't meant to get involved, to grow attached. But then again, wasn't that the problem? That justice had become a routine instead of a responsibility? He stood and walked to the window, resting one hand on the frame. And suddenly, without warning, he heard his father's voice, gravelly, firm, the way it always was when he was trying to pass down something he knew mattered. The law is a tool, son, but men are the conscience. Frank's throat tightened. He hadn't thought of that phrase in years, maybe decades, but today, it hit different. It wasn't just a memory, it was a reminder. He returned to his desk, sat down again, and let the silence stretch. His vision blurred slightly, but he didn't blink it away. The moisture in his eyes felt honest, earned. He thought of all the boys who had passed through his courtroom, some guilty, some lost, some already broken by the time they arrived. And now, this one, Manuel, who wasn't begging, who wasn't deflecting, who had simply placed his trust in him without asking for anything in return. Frank closed the file once more, this time with a certain reverence. The trial will resume in a few hours, and he knew now with quiet certainty that this case would follow him long after the gavel had fallen. Judge Frank Caprio sat a little straighter in his chair, a subtle crease forming between his brows as the clerk finished the roll call. Manuel Ramirez was already at the defense table, hands clasped, his expression unreadable. He had not spoken since yesterday's session, but today, something was different. His stillness didn't feel like waiting. It felt like preparation. "Your Honor," his court-appointed attorney began, standing with a paper in hand. "With the court's permission, we'd like to present a piece of evidence that was not included in the prosecution's disclosures." Frank glanced up sharply. "Explain." The lawyer nodded toward Manuel, who stood slowly, holding up a printed document. "This is a copy of the original police report filed by Mr. Lewis Thornton, the owner of the stolen vehicle," Manuel said. His voice was calm, deliberate. In his initial statement, he clearly describes the suspect as a white male, late teens, wearing a baseball cap. He paused, letting the words sink into the room like a stone into water. "I am not white. I was not wearing a cap." Frank reached for the copy the bailiff brought over, his fingers steady despite the storm rising quietly in his chest. He read the paragraph once, then again. The statement was clear, direct, and completely absent from the version provided by the prosecution. "Prosecutor," Frank said without looking up, "can you explain this omission?" The room froze. Gina Foster, the lead prosecutor, shifted in her chair. Her jaw tightened, and her lips parted as if to answer, but nothing came. She looked at the assistant beside her, then back at the judge. "Your Honor, we followed protocol. It's possible this statement was deemed irrelevant." Frank looked up then, slowly, coldly. "Irrelevant?" he echoed. Gina swallowed. "The victim described a different suspect entirely," he said, voice low. "And that was deemed irrelevant?" Her silence was answer enough. A quiet rustling passed through the courtroom, press members turning pages, jurors glancing at each other, a single cough from the gallery that sounded too loud in the heavy air. Frank leaned back in his chair, but his gaze stayed locked on the prosecution. This was not the first time he'd sat in judgment, but it was the first time in years he felt the full, trembling weight of what judgment meant. He turned slightly, eyes now on Manuel. "Mr. Ramirez," he said, "did you or your attorney request this report earlier?" Manuel nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. We were told there was no such statement." Frank turned back to the prosecution. "You gave misleading information to the defense?" Foster fumbled. I'll need to verify how the file was processed." "That won't be necessary," Frank said quietly. Then he reached for his notepad, and for the first time in a long while, began writing questions of his own. The courtroom seemed to shift around him, almost physically. His voice, usually reserved and restrained, now carried with it the firm cadence of someone who had stepped off the bench and back into something more personal. He asked about the chain of custody of the report. He asked why the forensics officer hadn't been called. He asked about the timeline, the GPS logs, and the patrol routes, questions no one expected him to ask. And with each one, Foster's composure thinned. The jurors leaned in. Even the bailiff stopped pretending not to listen. At one point, Foster interrupted, trying to object. "Your Honor, this line of questioning..." Frank raised a hand, not sharply, but with finality. "Sit down, counselor, I'm not done." He glanced toward the jury box. Some heads had begun to tilt, not out of confusion, but attention. Perspective was shifting, ever so slightly. Then he looked back at Manuel, who hadn't moved, still calm, still quiet. And finally, Frank returned his eyes to Foster. "I made a mistake once," he said, voice steady, eyes fixed. "A long time ago. I trusted the record more than the person. I let silence pass for truth." He paused, breathing in through his nose, then added softly, "This time, I'm not closing my eyes." Foster said nothing. She couldn't. Frank leaned back. "Court will resume after a short recess," he said, tapping the gavel once. But as he stood, his shoulders bore a different weight. Not just the robe, not just the law, but a decision is already forming. When Judge Frank Caprio returned to the courtroom, the murmurs quieted as if a hand had swept across the room. He took his seat with a calm so composed it felt sacred. The robe, the bench, the silence, they no longer separated him from the others. They simply held him in place for what he knew had to be done. He looked toward Manuel Ramirez, who stood without being told. The boy's expression hadn't changed. There was no expectation, no plea, just readiness. Caprio's fingers rested lightly on the edges of his notes. He didn't read them. "This court," he began, voice steady but low, "finds the evidence presented in this case to be incomplete, obscured, and compromised by the omission of critical testimony." The room froze. Not a breath moved. "In light of these failures, and with the burden of proof unmet," he said, eyes now fixed on Manuel, "the court dismisses all charges against the defendant, Mr. Manuel Ramirez." The moment didn't explode. It broke. Gasps filled the room, some from the gallery, others from the press, but none louder than the silence that followed. Manuel didn't move. He stood as if waiting for someone to say it again, as if afraid the words might be taken back. Caprio watched him closely. There, in the boy's stillness, he saw something familiar. A version of himself, young, misunderstood, pressed into a world that did not expect him to rise. And now, he had risen. For a moment, Frank's eyes softened. He looked at Manuel not as a judge, not as a man of the law, but as someone who had once been small and invisible too. His gaze held something unspoken, something a father might give a son who had found his way home. Outside, the courthouse steps were already crowded. Cameras angled upward, microphones extended like metal limbs. Questions waited, rehearsed and sharp. But when Judge Caprio stepped out, he didn't hesitate. He looked straight ahead, then turned briefly to the reporters and said just one thing. "Justice is never right," he said, "unless we make it so." Then he walked past them. That night, the house stood in stillness. Frank poured himself a glass of whiskey, his first in years. The sound of the liquid touching the glass was soft, but it marked something final. He didn't sit right away. He stood by the kitchen window, watching the moonlight stretch across the backyard like a memory. The front door creaked open. His wife's footsteps, familiar and slow, echoed through the hallway. "Frank?" she called, stopping when she saw him holding the glass. Her voice was warm but surprised. "Whiskey?" He turned slightly, his smile faint but real. "Just one," he said. It felt like the kind of night that deserved it. She slipped off her coat, draped it neatly over a chair. "What happened?" Frank took a sip, then sat at the edge of the armchair, the weight of the day finally settling into his bones. "I did something I should have done a long time ago," he said. Listened not just to the law, but to what I knew was right. Really listened. She watched him carefully, then walked over and sat beside him. "And how does that feel?" He exhaled slowly, the glass cradled between both hands. "Like something heavy cracked open and finally left me." She nodded, her hand reaching for his. "I'm proud of you, always have been." A quiet moment passed. The air between them was full, not with tension, but history. Then gently she said, "Maybe it's time, Frank. Maybe it's time to come home for good." Frank looked down at the glass, then over to her. Not startled, not even surprised, just quiet. "I've thought about it," he said softly, more than once. She smiled, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face. "You've given so much. No one could ask for more." He took a deep breath, his gaze steady. "But today reminded me, I'm not done yet. Not while there are still kids like that boy Manuel, standing alone in rooms built to crush them." She held his hand tighter. "You always carried them even when you didn't know their names." Frank smiled again, this time with a touch of weariness. "And now I do. That changes things." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "Then promise me something." "Anything. When the time comes, when you know it's right, don't wait too long." "I won't," he said, "but not just yet." And they sat there in the hush of their home, two lives shaped by decades, held together by faith and time. The whiskey untouched, the silence kind. The night was long, but finally at peace. A few weeks later, in a small cafe in the heart of the city. The bell above the door chimed softly as Judge Frank Caprio stepped inside, brushing the light chill from his coat sleeves. The place was modest, scuffed wooden floors, the faint smell of old espresso, and a few dusty books lining the windowsill. Frank spotted him near the back, sitting at a corner table, eyes low over a paper cup. Manuel Ramirez looked up as the judge approached. He stood out of habit, unsure whether to shake hands or sit down again. Frank settled that quickly with a warm nod and a gentle hand on the shoulder. "You came," Manuel said, a little surprised. "You asked," Frank replied, removing his coat. That seemed reason enough. They sat across from each other. For a few moments, neither spoke. The quiet between them wasn't awkward. It was earned. Frank stirred the sugar into his coffee slowly, letting the spoon tap once against the ceramic before resting it on the napkin. "I've been thinking a lot," Manuel began, his voice quieter than Frank remembered. "About what happened. About what could have happened." Frank met his eyes but said nothing, giving the boy space. "I used to think, once you walk out of court, that's it. You leave it all behind, but it stays with you," Manuel said. "Not just the fear, the way people look at you, the way they don't." Frank nodded slowly. "Yes, it does stay. But sometimes what stays can become something better." Manuel glanced down at the table, then reached into his backpack and pulled out a folded brochure. It was for a university, worn at the corners but still crisp in the center. "I'm thinking of applying, to study law." Frank didn't respond right away. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, brought out an envelope, and slid it across the table. "You won't need to think too long," he said. "That's a letter of recommendation, a personal one." Manuel stared at it, as if the paper might dissolve under his fingertips. "Why?" he asked after a moment. "Why would you do that for me?" Frank leaned back slightly, a smile touching the edge of his mouth. "Because I was you," he said. "Once. I was just a kid no one expected anything from. I needed someone to believe in me. I figured maybe it was time I returned the favor." Manuel didn't answer, but his eyes said more than words ever could. There was still a flicker of uncertainty there, but now it was joined by something stronger, something warmer. Hope. He stood, folding the envelope carefully and tucking it inside his jacket. "Thank you," he said, his voice firmer now. "For everything." Frank nodded, watching him go. Manuel paused at the door, one hand on the frame, the sunlight catching the edge of his sleeve. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. Frank remained at the table, letting the last of the afternoon sun spill across the floor. The warmth hit his face, and for a moment he closed his eyes, not to rest but to feel. The work wasn't over. The robe still hung in his office, but something in him had changed. Not everything in the courtroom had to be a battle. Sometimes it could be a beginning. He reached into his briefcase, pulled out the small leather journal he kept tucked between old case notes, and uncapped his pen with care. He wrote, "Every courtroom is a chance, not just to pass judgment, but to pull someone back from the edge. Today, I did that." He let the ink dry before closing the book. And as the cafe emptied around him, Frank Caprio sat quietly in the golden hush of late afternoon, no longer weighed down by the years behind him, but quietly ready for whatever lay ahead. Thank you for staying with us through Manuel's journey. If this story moved you, even just a little, then it's done what it was meant to do. Because sometimes, justice isn't about winning or losing. It's about being seen, being heard, and being given a second chance. Judge Caprio reminded us that a courtroom isn't just a place for verdicts, but for redemption. And maybe, just maybe, for hope. If you believe stories like this matter, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs a little faith in the system. Until next time, keep watching. Because the next story might be the one that changes you. All stories on this channel are fictional and for entertainment only. We believe in equal rights for all and aim to share messages of kindness, fairness, and dignity. Any similarities to real people or events are purely coincidental. These stories are free of political or religious intent and are designed to inspire, not to reflect or represent real-world entities.